Okay, thank you very much, everybody. So some of you guys may recognize me as the porter that was holding the door while you were all let in. It's very nice to be here today. So my name is Daniel Shepherd. I work with CSIS Group. We're a Danish cybersecurity company, and we're here to talk about, well, the title of the presentation was actually threat hunting, and then as I was doing the content for it, I decided to drop the word threat for reasons that might become apparent during the presentation. However, threat hunting, or the other things that are called something similar, is something that CSIS does, of course, as one of its core service offerings. So first of all, I'm going to give you a quick overview about the company, and then we're going to dive right into the content itself, and hopefully leave a little bit of time for any questions or comments. So as I say, CSIS, headquartered out of Copenhagen. We've been around for a little while, primarily, and given the background of the company, working in the financial services space, especially, of course, in Scandinavia, but also here in the UK. Over the years, of course, we've developed a presence outside of the financial services space as more and more industries have become exposed to, aware of, and involved in the cybersecurity industry. We're very much also collaborators with the law enforcement agencies, some of the, Europol, Interpol, the NCA over here in the UK, the FBI out of the US, and that helps with a lot of the investigative activities that we undertake, because the backbone of the company is actually in the threat intelligence space, something that, of course, feeds all the various different other services that we provide our customers. And some of our expertise are very much in reverse engineering. So we have, let's say, primary access to a lot of the threat intelligence that we provide, which makes some of our offerings really quite unique. All right, threat hunting. So basically, the way I'd like to start this presentation is by talking a little bit about why companies are increasingly becoming interested in and also aware of the importance of their cyber or security posture. It's something that traditionally has been quite difficult to sort of marry in terms of a technical concept with a business concept. And it reminds me, or tends to remind me, a little bit of where IT had its challenges a while ago as well, sort of the broader IT landscape. And that was translating the benefits that stem from being good at security into business language that general executives will understand. Obviously, you've always had and will always have, and increasingly are being subjected to, the concept of regulation and compliance, and that's one type of language that exists and is quite pertinent to the security space. But more and more companies are starting to become aware of other reasons why having a good security posture is important, and some of those things translate into very, very tangible things that, you know, top-level management are super interested in, which includes things, if you're a publicly traded company, or not as the case may be, but in the valuation of a company. So it's not uncommon these days that one talks to people who are involved in mergers and acquisitions, and they say, in the same way that we evaluate the risk exposure of a company in terms of their strategy, their competitive positioning, their financial health, their operating environment, any environmental risks, etc., security has become very much a part and parcel of that same due diligence process. But customers as well, I mean, in terms of the industries that are very much involved in a B2C concept, but also B2B and B2B2C, the concept of customers and their perspective on doing business, so to speak, with a given brand, and the degree to which one can trust that brand, again, has a lot to do with security. And of course, a lot of this is affected by the fact that things are so open in the media nowadays that it's inescapable that people end up finding out who has what kind of issues and how secure or not secure, as the case may be, their data is with those particular customers or companies. So the concept of cybersecurity posture, security posture, is becoming very, very relevant to companies in all industries. And of course, we all know the statistics in terms of, if we just look at data breaches, they're continuing to be a very, very prevalent feature in most industries existence. Most companies are concerned and are increasingly concerned about the possibility that they may have been or may be or will be exposed to breaches. And although the last year's numbers seem to suggest that there is a declining trend, that's not necessarily the case. If you look over a longer period of time, there's a trend, and that trend is not downward but upward. And of course, in terms of the sort of root cause around the breaches, hacking, what is traditionally known as hacking, is certainly the most common, the most common issue. And you could actually combine some of these into one category, because if you look at phishing, and in fact the one called virus and malware, I'd put them into the same category. So hacking is the greatest concern that companies face. Now, threat hunting is not exactly a new concept. Probably most of you have come across threat hunting in some shape or form. Whether you've been active users of such types of solutions and services is a different question. But it's been quite topical in the industry, because it's very much taken the concept of security and said, well, we can build defenses around our organization to try and prevent things from happening, but ultimately something may happen, and when that something happens, we need to be prepared. So suddenly you walk into the kind of incident response type scenario. But then incident response is also inherently reactive, because it's when something's already happened. So what about the degree to which one takes a proactive approach to finding threats, and what we also suggest is important, looking at the risks a company is exposed to. But generally speaking, people talk about threat hunting in the same sort of language. It's something which is indeed proactive, because you don't need to have experienced a breach in order to go out looking for the threats and risks that you're exposed to. It's also supposed to be iterative, so it's not something that you do as a one-off. It's actually quite sort of associated to the concept of a learning process. It's something that you get better at the more you do it. It is about searching. You're not looking for something that you necessarily already have predefined is there, which is the case in incident response, but you're starting potentially from a big question mark starting point and saying, what is it that I could be exposed to? It's about detecting, which is very much around the whole analysis layer involved in threat hunting. And obviously in most organizations today, that means considering that it's essentially a big data game. You're having to look through a lot of different data points in order to find the so-called, or the proverbial, needle in the haystack. And then ultimately it's about isolating, which is then starting to look at what remedial action needs to be put in place, which some people would define as being outside of the classic threat hunting scope, because then you are starting to talk about incident response. But as I'm going to make the point later, those two processes need to be very much intertwined. And it's very important to remember that threat hunting, or the sort of premise behind threat hunting, is essentially about finding those issues that have evaded detection based on all the other mechanisms that companies have in order to prevent things from happening. And there's no end of examples of the companies that have indeed got absolutely, enormous budgets for preventative security, but have still experienced issues. Now, some of you, all of you, will be familiar with Verizon's annual data breach report. The one for last year hasn't come out yet, I don't think, but the year before they had these interesting little graphs around the time it takes organizations to be compromised, and then they had a series of other graphs, but this one was the one that interested me the most, the time it then takes in order for organizations to detect that they have been compromised. And quite clearly, the two humps are in the wrong place, so to speak. The idea behind threat hunting is very much about how to make the discovery hump align itself a little bit more closely with the compromise hump. And I don't know, did anybody see the, I'm fairly sure you're aware of the Marriott case. Did anybody see the recent the Senate subcommittee hearing that took place in the U.S., where they basically questioned the CEO of Equifax, but also the CEO of Marriott. Anybody see that one? No? Okay, well, it's a rather long video, so I don't necessarily recommend that you go and watch it. It's about 2.5 hours long, but some of the content is actually quite interesting. I mean, first of all, through the process, they tell you about the timeline of the breach that both companies were subjected to, and the interesting thing is that in the Marriott's case, at least, there's this really big time lapse between the time that in the end, the investigators discovered was the original point of entry for the attackers, and when finally the organization woke up to the fact that something was wrong. Now, although it's not disclosed as such, I'm willing to bet that in the intervening period, there were quite a few other indicators that were probably not heeded that could have alerted to this breach earlier. Once the investigation starts to take place, everything starts to happen more quickly. Now, I happen to know which company did this investigation, and they're a very good company, so naturally the results started coming through. Sometimes investigations can take a lot longer than that, during which time the problem is just getting worse and worse and worse. Other times the investigations are not done in the right way, which means the root cause is never identified, and then companies end up being subjected to repeat incidents within a fairly short space of time. And that, of course, is an issue because, as you can see from some of these statistics, I mean, the amount of data that's at risk is absolutely enormous. But one of the reasons I wanted to pick out the Marriott case is going back to my earlier point about mergers and acquisitions. The Senate hearing went really hard in on Equifax, and rightly so, because their issue was quite a significant one. And they went a little bit lighter on the guy from Marriott, because they sort of said, well, it wasn't really Marriott's fault, because they acquired another company, and the name escapes me right now, but another hotel group, and it was that hotel group that had the problem. So Marriott inherited, Starwood, I think their name was, inherited the issue. And to my mind, that's not really an excuse, because since when has it been okay to acquire a company and then say, oops, we didn't realize that they had massive financial problems, for example, or that they were bleeding customers left, right, and center, and now the reason why we bought them is no longer valid as a premise. And I think the same sort of logic applies to cybersecurity and somebody's security posture. Due diligence, in that sense, is oriented towards identifying risk, and security is one of those risks that needs to be heeded. So, in my view, there's, again, more and more reasons why companies need to take the practice of threat hunting seriously. However, in terms of the way that threat hunting is done, there is about as many flavors. In fact, I would say there's more flavors to threat hunting than there are colors to the rainbow, and then some. So, you know, when you go to industry conferences, you'll hear a lot about how people are able to do threat hunting based on X, Y, and Z technologies. There's a big focus on the technological aspect, and there's a reason for that, and I'm not saying it's wrong, but there's certainly something to be considered about the fact that threat hunting is more of a discipline which should be powered by technology or enabled by technology, especially in kind of large-scale environments. But that's not all it is, and it's not just about repurposing technologies that we've invested in for other reasons in order to be able to get an ROI now that we have this concept of threat hunting that we can also pursue. So a lot of the challenges that people face around threat hunting is that in some ways, because it's so related to the forensics discipline in terms of what it's trying to achieve insight. But forensics doesn't necessarily scale very well in terms of the traditional approaches. It doesn't scale very well in terms of speed. It doesn't scale very well in terms of, in terms of cost. So people are starting to sort of say, well, how do I make a trade-off in terms of, do I achieve a level of insight that's decent, but do it really, really slowly, which means that I have to limit the scale at which I do it to places where I think my highest exposure of risk is at? Or do I find a different way to do things, which might be to go really broad and manage to cover my entire global network, for example, but at the same time actually have to sacrifice the level of depth of insight that I'm able to get. And so that doesn't seem particularly good in terms of a data collection strategy. At least I don't think so. Also, there is the idea that, of course, there's an ever-evolving set of strategies that criminals are using in terms of the whys they are attacking companies, the hows, the whats that they are approaching. And so oftentimes what we forget is that the whole data collection aspect of an investigation, of an investigative process, has to have a certain level of diversity and breadth in terms of the data that we're collecting in order to be able to get at those different attack vectors. Otherwise, we're going to be essentially cutting off parts of our field of vision right from the beginning. And that, again, doesn't make a lot of sense. Analytical flexibility is really important for two reasons. One, because I think that again, you all know about the issues that we have in the industry in relation to talent. So if you look at most organizations that provide security services, the number of people that can do forensic analysis or incident response or indeed threat hunting work, it's precious few. But those people have huge amounts of experience in terms of how to analyze incidents. So they need to be able to work with data in a particular way. But then a lot of other organizations would find that they have very rapidly got bottlenecks because of those resource shortages. So does that mean that you can't conduct investigations except with those few people? No, the idea is that, again, in here technology does indeed have a role to play, is able to provide that analytical flexibility through automation that allows other people to become part of those investigative teams. The establishment of root causes. So I talked about this just a few moments ago. The idea here is that if a company has been exposed to a certain type of incident, they may very well choose to think that that is what the incident was all about. And in fact, anything from the point of entry to the motivation for entry in the first place might be something very, very different to what they've seen. And if you're not going wide enough or deep enough in order to establish that root cause, you may very well find yourself taking decisions, remediation decisions, that are oriented towards the visible, but not towards the latent side of an incident. And we're very concerned about the latent part of the incident. And last but not least, if you consider, especially again in large-scale organizations, threat hunting can become prohibitive if it's cost prohibitive, if it's not being done in a particularly effective way. And that turns a lot of people off doing those types of exercises, and they tend to then focus much more on the reactive component of it, especially if they think that their organization is not particularly exposed to cyber risks in the first place. So what we started to talk about in terms of not so much threat hunting, but advanced hunting, to drop the term threat, it's different, we feel, because of the objectives that you're setting out to achieve, because of the scope of the exercise, because of the methodology being used, and the results that can be expected from such an exercise. So right now I'm kind of making the transition between talking about threat hunting to talking about this concept of advanced hunting. So first of all, a lot of people who are involved in the more business aspects of companies will know about when you're talking about key performance indicators, the difference between lead indicators and lag indicators. So, a lag indicator is where, unfortunately, most of us tend to focus our time. And that's because of the amount of noise in our companies and because of the amount of activities that we have. But the unfortunate reality is that lag indicators are very much those which tell you when something has already happened. Okay? So in security terms, if you've had a breach and information has been taken, the nature of that information and the nature of that breach is a lag indicator. The fact that you find that you've got a threat on your network, you've just identified a lag indicator. But by then, it's, quote, too late to do anything about it, except the remediation part, right? So I think it's all good and well to talk about threat hunting, and people absolutely need to focus on finding these types of threats and probably numbers of others, which are essentially points of evidence that someone is or has been on your network at some point in time, okay? But that's not where the story should stop. So we believe very much that any kind of hunting exercise should take the threats, but also look at the risks. And what we define as being risks are the lead indicators, the things that are suggesting that you're exposed to things which may then translate into threats if nothing is done about those risks. And again, these are just some of the examples of the types of risks that one can be looking for. But these are the really interesting ones to address. And I think most of you, through the stories that you're exposed to, and if you work with customers, be it external customers or internal customers, will know that most of the time when breaches occur, they occur because companies didn't do something about the risks. So we very much encourage hunting exercises to focus on both lead and lag indicators. Now, the other sort of, the second part of it is about the scope. So there's a lot of there's a lot of need, again, based on how things are being done, whereby people end up saying, I make certain assumptions. It's the kind of inductive logic of things. We are typically exposed to certain risks or threats, therefore we're going to go looking for those types of risks or threats. We are typically, if we look at our global network, we are typically exposed here and here, so therefore we're going to focus our efforts here and here. In the past, we've experienced incidents in a particular way, so therefore we're going to focus on finding those types of incidents. And that's kind of what experience can lead you towards, but especially when starting hunting programs, it shouldn't be like that. It should be much more deductively oriented. So you want to start as broad as possible. You want to take in your entire network. You want to look at all the various different operating systems you have in your environment, and you want wealth of what are essentially artifacts, data from your network to be able to analyze, in order not to be blindsided in the first place. So the scope needs to be much more all-encompassing in what I would call proper hunting work. In terms of methodology, so here there's a little bit of criticism towards the vendor community in security. There's a lot of need, again, based on the talent issue, for things like automation. And I think that that's, you know, a correct path to follow as an industry. However, it shouldn't be done in a way that sacrifices the potential for insight to be generated. So part of the sort of way in which people address automation through technology is by reducing the amount of noise, the level of complexity that an analyst or a consultant or an investigator has to deal with. And that has to do with the age-old problem of false positives. So people end up finding ways through different types of rule sets and other methodologies to reduce and reduce and reduce the noise until someone is able to say, this is the one data point that you need to pay attention to. But the problem with that noise reduction strategy is that oftentimes it leads to indicators of compromise that may not be so obvious being thrown out and never looked at. And that's a very dangerous strategy to follow, according to me. So I think it's very important, on the flip side, I think it's very important to help people achieve a degree of prioritization. Because yes, there is limited resources, yes, there is a limitation in terms of time, but if you help people prioritize, then you should also help them to be able to drill deeper and deeper into data sets. If you're unable to do that, if it stops at the first level of priority and people are not able to explore further, then like I say, I think you're potentially exposing them to threats and or risks that they will never be aware of until it's too late. So I think that the concept of technology, and we're talking about methodology, the concept of technology in hunting is about helping to prioritize people's work. It's helping to identify the really critical points that should be addressed first, but it shouldn't exclude the possibility to then take that investigation further. I also think it's quite important to talk about forensic validity, because in the end, whether it's for internal reasons or external reasons, some of these investigations need to be used in more formal settings. And the problem that I've observed is that people end up using methodologies and tools that are not forensically valid, and they end up actually leading down, well, potential rabbit holes which are not very healthy. On the one hand, you can have issues with the actual integrity of the data in the first place, so people are ending up either modifying or downright deleting data, source data that they really might need later on in order to have a second sort of look at things, or the actual interpretation of that data is not being done in the right way. And one classic one is simply the concept of time. If you're one of the typical things that an investigator needs to do when investigating proactively or reactively an incident is to establish a timeline for the things that occurred. But there's a whole set of issues around the usage of timestamps in data, which if you're not sensitive to, can lead to quite erroneous conclusions in terms of how things happened, when they happened, and what cause led to what effect. So it's very important to do that. And for a person to do that, again, at a large scale with lots and lots of data, is incredibly time consuming and painful to do and can lead to human error all over the place. Tool set integrity or consistency. It's not unusual to find that people are using multiple tools which are coming from different places, different vendors, open source tools that were made in-house. Some of them are really good for data collection of a particular type and then data collection of another particular type. Other ones are good at parsing that data. Other ones are good for type of analysis A, type of analysis B, type of analysis C. When you have such and literally investigators will say we use 20, 25, 30 different things during the course of our work. Like, well, that itself lends itself to another set of issues again, because how do you manually reconcile things so that they are internally consistent? So again, we need to be very sensitive to what we're using, how we're using it, to make sure that the outputs actually represent something meaningful in terms of the inputs that were collected in the first place. And then it's a very important point, if we're talking about something that's iterative, the idea is that, of course, threat hunting and incident response are two quite different disciplines. But the two things are very, very interconnected. And that's not only a technological point or a process point, it's also an organizational point. It's very difficult to have two separate teams working with two completely disjointed mandates and expect good results across the board. So there's something to be taken away about the concept of hunting and making sure that it's something that's integrated into the organization at an organizational level, at a process level, as well as anything else. So I have no idea how I'm doing with time, but the concept behind threat hunting is that, or hunting, is that in the end, there's ways in which, and this is about the expected results, there's ways in which you can determine if you've got open doors which people can exploit in order to enter your house. There's other approaches that will tell you how people might move and the kinds of things that they might do once they are inside your house. But really, the appropriate way to do hunting should give you the answer to various questions. First of all, to tell you if someone's already inside your house and you're just simply unaware of it, which is, again, going back to the graphs that I showed before from the Verizon report, the difference between the time it takes to compromise a system and the time it takes to detect that compromise has happened. The how the intruder got in there. So this is about the root cause analysis, doing it diligently, doing it deeply enough to establish the true root cause. What sort of things people have been up to since getting there? Well, that's important because you want to know about the attacker's tactics and their intentions and their motivations. And it's too easy to make assumptions which are erroneous in that sense if you don't have the right data to look into. And of course, the concept stemming from that is, okay, one thing is how do we deal with the breach that we've got today? Another concept is how do we stop breaches from happening in the future? And that's got, again, going back to my point about risks, more to do with risks than it does with threats. And that's the end of my presentation. And any questions or comments?